November 23, 1945, time 15 p.m., Bad Nauheim, Germany. General George Smith Patton, Jr., commander of the Third Army, sat alone in his temporary headquarters, a requisitioned German villa overlooking the frost-covered Bavarian countryside. At 60 years old blood and guts had just finished reading the most comprehensive intelligence briefing he had ever received about the Eastern Front. The thick manila folder marked "Classified" lay open on his mahogany desk, its contents spread across the polished surface like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. For 3 hours, he had absorbed report after report, photograph after photograph, statistic after statistic about what had transpired between Hitler's Wehrmacht and Stalin's Red Army from 1941 to 1945. The room was dead silent except for the rhythmic ticking of an ornate German clock on the mantelpiece. Outside, snow began to fall on the rubble of the Third Reich. Inside, one of America's most legendary generals was experiencing something he had never felt before: the complete shattering of his understanding of modern warfare. The intelligence reports had begun arriving at Patton's headquarters 3 weeks earlier. As Allied forces systematically processed captured German military archives and interviewed thousands of Wehrmacht officers now held in prisoner-of-war camps across occupied Germany. Colonel Oskar Koch, Patton's intelligence chief, had spent months compiling what would become the most detailed Western analysis of the Eastern Front campaign ever assembled. The documentation was staggering in its scope and horrifying in its implications. Battle casualty reports from the Sixth Army at Stalingrad showed losses that exceeded the entire strength of Patton's Third Army. Wehrmacht after-action reports from Operation Barbarossa described engagements involving more men, tanks, and artillery than had fought in the entire Western European campaign. Soviet prisoner interrogations revealed industrial production figures that dwarfed anything the Allies had achieved. German intelligence estimates of Red Army strength showed force deployments that made D-Day look like a division-level exercise. What had shaken Patton most profoundly was not just the scale of the Eastern Front, but the nature of the warfare itself. The Western Front, for all its violence and complexity, had been conducted according to recognizable rules of engagement. Prisoners were generally taken and treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Civilians were largely protected. Military objectives were clearly defined and pursued through conventional tactical means. The Eastern Front had been something entirely different: a war of racial extermination, conducted with an intensity that exceeded anything in recorded military history. Wehrmacht situation reports described entire Soviet armies being encircled and destroyed in single operations. Red Army after-action summaries documented German army groups being systematically annihilated during massive winter counteroffensives. The numbers were beyond comprehension. 27 million Soviet dead, 4 million German military casualties, entire cities reduced to rubble through siege warfare that lasted years. Patton had built his reputation as the master of mobile warfare, the general who had led the Third Army across France and into the heart of Germany with unprecedented speed and efficiency. His armored spearheads had advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, crushing German resistance and liberating territory at a pace that amazed even his critics. He had prided himself on understanding the mechanics of modern warfare better than any commander in the Allied forces. He knew how to coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, and air support to achieve maximum tactical advantage. He understood logistics, communications, and the psychological factors that determined victory or defeat in armored combat. But the Eastern Front reports revealed military operations on a scale that made his greatest victories seem small and provincial by comparison. The Battle of Kursk alone had involved more tanks than existed in the entire Western Allied inventory. Operation Bagration had destroyed an entire German army group in 5 weeks, eliminating more enemy divisions than Patton had faced during his entire European campaign. The siege of Leningrad had lasted 872 days and cost more lives than the United States had lost in the entire war. The Battle of Berlin had involved urban combat more intense than anything American forces had encountered, with Soviet artillery firing more shells in the final assault than the U.S. had manufactured in some entire months of production. The Wehrmacht had deployed 8 million men in the initial invasion of the Soviet Union, more troops than the United States had sent to all theaters of operation combined. The intelligence reports contained detailed testimonies from German officers who had served on both fronts, and their comparisons were stark and unanimous. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored doctrine, had described the Eastern Front as a struggle for national survival that made our operations in France look like maneuvers. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had told interrogators that the scale of combat in Russia exceeded anything we had prepared for or could have imagined. Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici had characterized the final Soviet offensive as the most massive and sustained military operation in human history. These were not inexperienced junior officers or political propagandists. These were veteran commanders who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia, and who understood the relative intensity of combat across all theaters. What disturbed Patton even more than the scale of Eastern Front operations was the growing realization that the Western Allies had been fighting a secondary campaign, while the Soviet Union had borne the primary weight of destroying German military power. The Wehrmacht had deployed 80% of its total strength against the Red Army throughout most of the war. German panzer divisions that had been reduced to company strength on the Eastern Front were being transferred west to face Allied forces as full-strength units on paper, but with combat effectiveness that had been shattered by years of attrition warfare in Russia. The vaunted Atlantic Wall had been defended primarily by static divisions, foreign volunteers, and units recovering from Eastern Front service. The German forces that had opposed the Normandy landings, while competent and well-equipped, represented a fraction of Wehrmacht strength and capability. If you want to discover how one of America's greatest generals came to understand that everything he thought he knew about World War II was fundamentally incomplete, please leave your like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next episodes. Soviet industrial production figures contained in the intelligence reports were equally shocking to Patton's understanding of the global balance of power. The Red Army had fielded more tanks in 1943 alone than the United States had produced during the entire war. Soviet artillery production had exceeded combined British and American output by a factor of 3 to 1 during peak wartime production. The T-34 tank, which Patton had dismissively characterized as crude but numerous, had been produced in quantities that dwarfed total German armored vehicle manufacturing. More than 84 000 T-34s had rolled off Soviet production lines during the war, compared to approximately 25 Su-0 German tanks and self-propelled guns of all types. The Katyusha rocket launcher, which Soviet forces had employed as standard divisional artillery, had been manufactured in quantities that exceeded total American artillery production across all calibers and types. The human cost of Eastern Front operations defied comprehension through any framework of reference available to American military planners. The Battle of Stalingrad had resulted in more casualties than the United States had suffered in all theaters of World War II combined. The siege of Leningrad had killed more civilians than lived in New York City. Soviet military casualties during the first year of German invasion had exceeded total American military deaths in all wars in national history. The Red Army had lost more men in single battles than the United States had deployed in entire campaigns. German casualties on the Eastern Front had been so severe that by 1944, Wehrmacht divisions were being manned primarily by teenagers and men over 45, with experienced NCOs and junior officers representing an increasingly small percentage of unit strength. The intelligence reports contained detailed analyses of Soviet tactical innovations that had never been employed against Western Allied forces. Deep battle doctrine, developed by Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and refined through years of combat experience, had enabled Red Army forces to conduct sustained offensive operations across fronts, measuring hundreds of miles in length. Soviet mastery of winter warfare had allowed them to launch major offensives during seasons when German forces were barely capable of defensive operations. Red Army artillery tactics had evolved to achieve concentrations of firepower that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had faced on other fronts. Soviet use of engineer troops and obstacle construction had created defensive positions that required specialized assault techniques unknown in Western European combat. Most disturbing to Patton was the emerging realization that Soviet military leadership had demonstrated strategic vision and tactical competence that equaled or exceeded anything achieved by Western Allied commanders. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had planned and executed operations involving multiple army groups across fronts that spanned entire countries. Marshal Ivan Konev had demonstrated mastery of combined arms warfare that surpassed the achievements of any American general. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky had conducted mobile operations that exceeded the scope and complexity of Patton's own armored campaigns. These were not political appointees or Communist Party functionaries. These were professional military officers who had developed and implemented tactical doctrines under combat conditions that American forces had never faced. Do you have a grandfather, father, or uncle who served and never spoke about what they experienced? These stories are disappearing. Leave a comment now saying simply, "My grandfather served," or "My father served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family. You're preserving memory for future generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. The strategic implications of Eastern Front operations were equally profound for Patton's understanding of post-war global power relationships. The Red Army that was now occupying half of Europe represented a military force that had been tested and proven through 4 years of the most intensive combat in military history. Soviet divisions advancing through Poland and into Germany were veteran units with combat experience that exceeded anything possessed by Western Allied forces. Red Army tank crews had fought in dozens of major engagements against the best German panzer units. Soviet infantry had conducted assault operations against fortified positions that dwarfed anything encountered during the Western European campaign. Soviet artillery officers had mastered techniques of mass bombardment that had never been employed against American or British forces. Patton had always prided himself on his ability to assess enemy capabilities and intentions with clinical precision. His rapid advance across France had been possible largely because he had understood German tactical doctrine well enough to predict and exploit Wehrmacht weaknesses. His success in the Battle of the Bulge had resulted from his accurate assessment of German intentions and his ability to coordinate Third Army repositioning faster than enemy commanders thought possible. But the Eastern Front reports revealed that his understanding of relative military capabilities had been based on incomplete information about the true balance of forces in the European theater. The Red Army units that American forces had encountered briefly during the link-up at the Elbe River represented the survivors of military operations that had no parallel in American military experience. These were divisions that had fought their way from Moscow to Berlin through battles that had each exceeded the scale of the largest American campaigns. They possessed equipment that had been tested under combat conditions, far more severe than anything Western Allied forces had faced. Their officers had commanded operations involving millions of men and thousands of tanks across distances that exceeded the entire scope of American deployments in Europe. What shook Patton most profoundly was the recognition that the Soviet military machine now positioned across Central Europe represented a force projection capability that potentially exceeded anything the United States could deploy. Red Army logistics had sustained multi-million-man offensive operations across supply lines extending thousands of miles through devastated territory. Soviet industry had demonstrated production capacity that had sustained forces larger than total American military strength, while simultaneously replacing catastrophic material losses. Soviet military leadership had proven its competence through the successful conduct of the largest and most complex military campaign in human history. The implications for American post-war strategic planning were clear and disturbing. The United States had emerged from World War II as the dominant Western power, with industrial capacity and military technology that seemed to guarantee continued global influence. But the Eastern Front report suggested that American military power, while advanced in certain technical areas, represented a fraction of the force projection capability that the Soviet Union had developed and maintained during the war. American divisions were smaller, less experienced in large-scale operations, and supported by industrial infrastructure that had never been tested under conditions comparable to those that had shaped Soviet military development. Patton realized that his entire understanding of modern warfare had been shaped by campaigns that, while successful and significant, represented a secondary theater of operations. The Western European campaign had been conducted against German forces that had been systematically weakened by 3 years of attrition warfare on the Eastern Front. Allied success in Normandy, while tactically and logistically impressive, had been achieved against opposition that represented a fraction of Wehrmacht's strength and capability. American armored doctrine, which had proven effective against reduced-strength German panzer units, had never been tested against forces comparable to those that the Red Army had faced and defeated during major Eastern Front campaigns. The Wehrmacht that had fought desperately to contain Allied advances through France and into Germany was the same military organization that had been systematically destroyed and reconstituted multiple times during Eastern Front operations. German divisions that had seemed formidable to Western Allied forces had been classified by Wehrmacht staff officers as combat ineffective compared to the strength levels required for Eastern Front service. The Panzer Lehr Division, considered one of the most elite German units during the Normandy campaign, had been assembled from training units and Eastern Front veterans who were no longer considered fit for service against the Red Army. As evening shadows began to darken the windows of his headquarters, Patton closed the final intelligence report and leaned back in his chair. The implications were inescapable. The United States had won World War II as a junior partner in a coalition dominated by Soviet military power. American industrial capacity and technological innovation had been crucial to Allied victory, but the primary burden of destroying German military capability had been borne by forces that had demonstrated operational competence on a scale that exceeded anything American commanders had achieved. The Red Army that now controlled half of Europe was not a crude peasant militia armed with obsolete equipment. It was a modern military force that had proven its effectiveness through sustained combat against the most professional army in the world. The realization that would haunt Patton for the remaining months of his life was that the United States, despite its technological advantages and industrial capacity, was potentially unprepared for military confrontation with an adversary that had been forged through 4 years of total warfare. American military doctrine, while effective against weakened German forces, had not been tested against opposition comparable to what Soviet forces had routinely faced and overcome. American industrial production, while impressive by peacetime standards, had not approached the levels of sustained output that had enabled the Soviet Union to replace massive material losses while simultaneously expanding force structure. American military leadership, while competent and innovative, had not been tested under conditions comparable to those that had produced the generation of Soviet marshals, now controlling the largest military force in human history. The strategic miscalculation that Patton now perceived was not merely about relative military capabilities, but about fundamental assumptions regarding the nature of modern warfare and the requirements for sustained military effectiveness. The Western European campaign had been conducted according to principles of limited warfare, with clear political objectives, defined rules of engagement, and careful attention to minimizing friendly casualties. The Eastern Front had been conducted as total warfare, with unlimited objectives, no restrictions on tactics or targeting, and acceptance of casualty levels that would be politically unacceptable in democratic societies. The Red Army had been shaped by this experience into a military instrument, capable of absorbing and inflicting losses on a scale that exceeded anything contemplated in American military planning. What terrified Patton was not simply Soviet military power, but the recognition that American political leadership appeared unaware of the true balance of global forces that would shape the post-war world. The United States was proceeding with demobilization plans that would reduce American military strength to peacetime levels, while the Soviet Union maintained forces that had been tested and proven through the most intensive military campaign in history. American diplomats were negotiating with Soviet representatives as equals, apparently unaware that the military foundation of American negotiating position was far weaker than Soviet capabilities suggested. The assumption of continued Western dominance that shaped American post-war planning was based on incomplete understanding of relative military effectiveness, as demonstrated through actual combat experience. Patton's concerns extended beyond immediate military considerations to fundamental questions about the nature of democratic societies and their capacity for sustained military competition with totalitarian regimes. The Soviet Union had demonstrated the ability to maintain total wartime mobilization for 4 years, while sustaining casualties and material losses that would have broken democratic resolve in Western societies. Soviet industrial production had reached levels that exceeded anything achieved in the United States, despite starting from a much lower baseline and operating under conditions of constant military pressure. Soviet military leadership had proven its competence under combat conditions that had never tested American commanders. The Red Army represented not simply a large military force, but a military organization that had been refined and proven through sustained combat against professional opposition. The intelligence reports that covered Patton's desk represented more than historical documentation of past campaigns. They were a window into military capabilities and doctrinal development that would shape global power relationships for the indefinite future. The Soviet Union that emerged from World War II was not the backward agricultural society that American planners had envisioned. It was an industrial and military power that had demonstrated capabilities exceeding those of any nation in history. The Red Army was not a temporary wartime force that would disappear with the return of peace. It was a permanent military establishment that had been forged through combat experience that no other military organization possessed. The reports showed that Patton's understanding of Soviet capabilities had been shaped by propaganda and political considerations, rather than accurate military intelligence. Western media had consistently portrayed the Red Army as brave but poorly equipped, numerous but tactically unsophisticated, effective only because of massive numerical superiority and willingness to accept horrific casualties. The reality revealed in the intelligence documents was fundamentally different. A military organization that had mastered modern combined arms warfare, developed innovative tactical doctrines, and achieved industrial production levels that supported sustained high-intensity operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. In his final months of life, Patton would speak privately to trusted staff officers about his growing conviction that the United States was entering the post-war period at a fundamental disadvantage relative to Soviet military power. His concerns were not primarily about Soviet intentions, though he had serious doubts about communist political objectives, but about relative capabilities and the implications of those capabilities for American strategic planning. The United States possessed superior naval forces, air superiority over American territory, and exclusive access to atomic weapons, but these advantages might prove insufficient to offset Soviet superiority in conventional ground forces and proven effectiveness in sustained military operations. The documents that had shattered Patton's confidence in American military supremacy remained classified for decades after his death in December 1945. His warnings about Soviet military capabilities were dismissed by political leaders who preferred to believe that American technological superiority and industrial capacity guaranteed continued global dominance. The intelligence assessments of Red Army effectiveness were suppressed or ignored by military planners who could not reconcile the implications with existing strategic assumptions. Only decades later, as historians gained access to Soviet military archives and the full scope of Eastern Front operations became clear, would Patton's concerns prove remarkably prescient. The Eastern Front had indeed been a different kind of war, fought on a scale and with an intensity that exceeded anything contemplated in American military planning. The Red Army had been forged through this experience into a military instrument capable of operations that dwarfed anything achieved by Western forces. The Soviet Union had emerged from World War II not as a weakened ally, grateful for American assistance, but as a military superpower that had proven its capabilities through sustained combat against the most professional military force in the world. The implications of this reality would shape global politics for the next half-century, just as Patton had foreseen during those dark November days when he finally understood what had really happened on the Eastern Front. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Each like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about generals who saw the truth when others preferred comfortable illusions, intelligence officers who documented realities that contradicted official narratives, military leaders who understood the implications of combat experience that exceeded anything in their own backgrounds. Real people, real insights that shaped history. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Poland, Russia, Canada, Australia. Our community extends around the world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that General George S. Patton's final insights don't disappear into silence. These leaders deserve to be remembered, and you're helping to make that possible.